And really, to understand what took place on this trip coming up to Israel, you have to go back to about 6 months before. We were in Strasbourg, France at the European Center for Law and Justice, our offices in Strasbourg, and I had been concerned about stories we were starting to hear in the press about the persecution of Christians in Middle East countries, specifically Egypt, of course, Iran. We were hearing stories out of Syria, cases coming out of the West Bank and Gaza. So the predicate to this rescue story that took place out of Gaza over Christmas really goes back to the summer when we were sitting at a conference table in Strasbourg, and the former Attorney General of the United States, John Ashcroft, who's a fellow at the American Center for Law and Justice, was with us, and we had a group of our lawyers from all over the world in, and we were talking about these immigration and asylum cases and how we could get involved. And as soon as we were sitting at that table, literally within about 20 or 30 minutes, we're in this magnificent conference room in Strasbourg, an email comes in, a request from a couple that were located in the UK, in the United Kingdom.
So we got a phone call and an email that came in, and this is how all of these has happened. It's really unbelievable. As we were talking about engaging in this issue, we had not really discussed it before. We weren't really ready to engage it before because these are diplomatic, legal, political, these involve violent groups.
He was a Syrian who had become a Christian while studying at the United Arab Emirates. She was a Palestinian who became a Christian through Christian television. And they applied for political asylum, they were denied, and they were about to be shipped back. They contacted us and said, is there anything you could do? And we dispatched a team to the United Kingdom. Jordan led the team. We had lawyers, our government affairs staff, our media people were there.
We all mostly came from politics and legal backgrounds. These were people who are in law school, finishing law school, who thought they would be corporate attorneys or thought they would be working back on presidential campaigns, which is where I came from, and going back to Washington to do that. And now we're able to work on these issues, and you've gotten to see a whole team come together. And I think sometimes that's how it happens. People who don't plan on doing this kind of work, who end up focusing the majority of their time on it.
And we ended up winning that case. And that sent a shockwave around the country because it was not just in the United Kingdom, but really around the world. Because at that point, it was the first case where evangelicals or Christians that were from what they called non-Orthodox churches were entitled to asylum status, because the fact of the matter is, for our client in the United Kingdom, he would have been sentenced back. It would have been a death sentence for him. He would have gone back to Syria. They would have killed him and his wife. It's called an honor killing. They're allowed to do it under Sharia law. And that case was then publicized through our media and through, of course, through court opinions. And then we started getting literally inundated with requests for help. They poured in from countries around the globe. And of course, one of the most significant ones, because of the personal side of this, was the case involving Pauline and her family.
One of our assistants, she said, we got this call in, and I think you should probably handle this because I know you just came back from the UK on this, and it was from Lisa, who has been in the television broadcast, who runs a group called Father's House International, which focuses mostly on widows and orphans around the world, in the Palestinian territories, in Zimbabwe, in Guatemala, and other places around the world, places where these widows and orphans really need help. And a secondary focus, of course, is the spreading of the gospel, but it is a very focused aid organization in that sense. And it's a small organization run out of Kentucky here in the United States. What happened was, and that's why these emails that we send are so important, is she was in, I think, Zimbabwe. One of her friends from Oregon, who she knew through her ministry, got the email about the story and the footage that we did coming from the UK about the couple that we had helped get asylum in the United Kingdom. Her friend, who knew about Lisa working with the Ayad family, forwarded it to Lisa. And she had known about the ACLJ and our work before at the Supreme Court in the United States and even in Europe, but she had no idea that we would be engaging this kind of issue. So she cold called.
And they needed help. And they needed help because this was the real classic case of the kind of discrimination and hostility and persecution that's taking place around the globe. In the United States, we should never call religious acts of discrimination, and we have them, obviously. We litigate those all the time. That's not persecution. Persecution is when someone is killed for their faith, and that's exactly what happened.
body of a Palestinian Christian was dumped in a field near the Zaytun neighborhood in Gaza City Sunday. The man, Rami Ayad, was director of the Protestant Holy Bible Society and had been stabbed to death. Since the outbreak of Intifada 7 years ago, thousands of Palestinian Christians living in the West Bank and Gaza have fled abroad. Since the Hamas takeover in Gaza, Palestinian Christians have been subjected to attacks, Christian schools and other Christian-affiliated institutes.
Rami ran the Christian bookstore in the West Bank, in Gaza actually, and there was one in the West Bank as well, but he was in charge of Gaza. He lived in Gaza, they ministered in Gaza. They were a well-liked family, 30 years old. He had 3 young children, 2 were born at that time. And Hamas decided to murder him. And his crime was that he was a Christian.
I was actually in Israel when Rami was assassinated the year before. And so we knew the story. It was a well-known story, but we did not know how to get in touch with the family or what had happened with the family. For all we knew, they may have gotten out, and it just wasn't a story that was made. So we hear from, I start working with Lisa. By the next week, we're on the phone with the Ayad family. Some of the Ayad family was already in Bethlehem. They had already fled Gaza. Rami's mother, his 2 brothers, his 2 sisters had already fled with their families, their husbands, their wives, and some of their young children into Bethlehem in the West Bank, which is a much better place for Christians. And that's where Pauline wanted to go. She wanted to take her and her children. She was actually, and this is important to point out, Pauline is 30 years old. She was pregnant, just a couple months pregnant, with her 3rd child when Rami was assassinated.
One of the interesting aspects of this afterwards was the reaction of the community, including even some of the Muslim community. There were 10,000 people that showed up for his funeral. When I saw the tape of the funeral, it had a huge impact on me because they were in this area controlled by one of the most militant Muslim terrorist organizations in the world, Hamas. You see this minister carrying this gold cross, walking down the streets of Gaza for this funeral. It was quite a testimony in and of itself, just the presence of the cross during this funeral. But the funeral was very moving. You see this young widow with 3 children. We knew we had to act. We started working with the family through weekly conference calls so that we could develop a relationship with them. And let me tell you something. They were weary at first. And they were weary because they've been trying to get Pauline out of Gaza for 9 months. And they've had various different organizations promise to do something and not deliver. What was increasingly happening was the Islamic cleric in the community where they lived was starting to show up. And when he was showing up, or his wife was showing up, or people from the mosque were showing up, they were demanding custody of the children because under Sharia law, once the husband's dead, the cleric could raise them. And of course, that would take the children being raised within the Christian faith and convert them to Islam. And that was the goal of the cleric. At that point, to me, it's increases. Now it's a life and death struggle for Pauline and her family, both spiritually and literally physically. So we got very involved very quickly. A lot of people were working on this. We have, broad resources and we have assets around the world. A lot of people don't know that about the ACLJ. We have a special operations unit that operates in Israel. We have lawyers in Moscow, Russia. We have lawyers throughout Europe. We have lawyers that we work with in the Far East. I mean, we have lawyers around the globe. This was complex. We had a diplomatic aspect to it, a legal aspect of it. So you had both the diplomatic, the legal, and then what we did not know was ultimately we're going to need the military.